The grandkids were over yesterday, so we had a nice bonfire at night. They just loved it. But now I'm left with all these ashes. What should I do with them? Are ashes good for the garden? That's what we're going to have a look at in this video. Before I try to answer that question, it's important to understand what ashes are and what are their characteristics. What is it about ashes that would make them good for the garden? The first thing to note is that ashes have a very high pH. The pH can be anywhere from 10 to 12, and that's very alkaline. Now that can be a good thing or a bad thing. About 20% of the ash is calcium, and it's in the form of something called calcium carbonate. The NPK of ash is a 013, so it has no nitrogen, a little bit of phosphorus, and a lot of potassium. And a lot of people recommend ashes for the garden because of that potassium. Now it also has a number of micronutrients, and I'll put those on the screen. The amounts of those are pretty low, and we can more or less ignore those. Now, there is some concern about heavy metals in ash. Ash does contain heavy metals, but the amounts are fairly low, and they're really not a concern for the garden. Now, there are different types of ash. What we had here was a fire that burned some of my tree wood, so things like maples, ash, and beech. That's called a wood ash. Now, some people burn garbage, and that also produces ash, but that's something you should never put in the garden. That should go in the garbage bin. Now, not all wood is really wood. A lot of the wood we now use in construction is what I like to call an artificial wood. Things like plywood, for instance, or particle board. A good part of that is wood, but there's also a lot of glues and other things incorporated in that. If I was going to use that ash, I wouldn't put it in my vegetable garden, but it's probably safe to put in your perennial gardens. To be honest, it probably won't hurt the vegetables either, but you might as well be on the safe side. There's also something called coal ash. If you're burning coal to get heat, you will end up with an ash from that. That product I wouldn't put in the garden. Ash has a very high pH, and that's due to the large amount of calcium carbonate in the ash. Now you might recognize calcium carbonate as being the main ingredient in limestone. And if you have acidic soil and you want to raise that pH, limestone is often recommended for that. Ash will do the same thing as limestone because they're both calcium carbonate. Ash actually works faster because the carbonate in ash is more readily available than the one in limestone. So if you're liming your soil, ash is a great thing to add. Most plants like to grow in a pH between 6 and 7. So if your soil is anywhere from 6 or higher, don't add ash because you don't want to raise the pH of that soil. That's the most important consideration. Unless your soil is very acidic, don't use ash. If you have acidic soil and you grow a lot of acidic-loving plants like rhododendrons, azaleas, and blueberries, don't use ash because the ash will raise the pH and those plants like the acidic soil that you have. If you're growing potatoes, a higher pH can result in the potatoes getting more fungus attack and scab. So don't use ash in a vegetable bed if you're growing potatoes. Now, if you have acidic soil, you're down around 5.5 or lower, ash is good to raise the pH and add nutrients to your soil. Now, before you run off and throw the ash in your garden, there's a couple other issues you should be aware of. The first one is that the potassium in the ash is very soluble. So if you put ash on the ground, the potassium almost immediately becomes plant available and a rain will wash it into the soil. So it disappears pretty quickly. If you look at the NPK of ash, it has a 0 nitrogen value. So a lot of people think, well, I'll take the ash and I'll add some nitrogen to it, maybe some urea or some sort of nitrate, and then mix that together and then put that in the garden. That's actually a really bad idea because the high pH of the ash reacts with the nitrogen and releases ammonia gas. So the nitrogen fertilizer you think you're adding to the soil actually ends up going into the air and is completely wasted. It's much better to put your ash on 1 week, Wash it in really good. Come back a week or two later and then fertilize with your nitrogen. Don't do them at the same time. Now you can use ash in two different ways in the garden. A lot of people suggest that you should take the ash, put it in your compost pile. I'm not really sure why they suggest that, but I know that some people think that compost is acidic, and if we add this alkaline ash, it will neutralize the compost. But that's a myth. A compost pile does become acidic very early on in the process. By the time that compost is finished, its pH is neutral. It's around 7, maybe 6.8, but that's not acidic. Plants like 6.8. So don't add ash to your compost pile for that reason. The other reason people add it to the compost, they think that it's going to compost, but ash won't compost. The process of heating and burning the wood has already done all of that composting for you. You're now left with a bunch of free nutrients. And in fact, if you take your ash and put it on top of your compost pile, and then you water it in, or it rains, all of that potassium will run away. So you've lost the potassium. So there's really no point in putting ash in a compost pile. If you want to use the ash, spread it on your garden. You can dig it in a bit, but you don't need to do that. Just spread it on like a layer of mulch, and it will get dug into the soil slowly. Now, how much should you use? The most common recommendation is about 10 pounds for 1,000 square feet. Some people use twice that amount. Remember that you're fertilizing to replace the nutrients that are missing from your soil. If you have a lot of calcium, you might want to use less ash. If your soil is high in potassium already, you may not even want to put the ash in there because it's not going to help you a lot unless you're trying to change pH. The more nutritious your soil is already, the less ash you should add. But 10 pounds per 1,000 square feet won't do any harm. Now, there's only one last thing to discuss about ash. It's not all ash. Some of it is still pieces of wood and pieces of charcoal. So what do you do with that? Do you have to separate this out? Not really. Lots of people buy charcoal and put it in the soil. So this is fine. When it comes to larger pieces that are mostly wood, you could pick these out. But remember, wood mulch is great for the garden. So if I throw this in the garden, it's just a piece of mulch. So you might as well just leave it in here. I hope that answers your questions about ash. It's excellent for the garden if you know what you're doing. If you don't know the pH of your soil, don't use it. And unless your soil is very acidic, don't use it. For most gardeners, you're better off taking this ash and throwing it in the garbage. Happy gardening!